Thank you for inviting me. It would be a pleasure to answer your questions in both official languages.
Text and then give us sort of a sense of where we stand with sort of the current bill and some of the things that I think could be remedied there in a broader sort of way forward. So, I mean, the context has to be clear. Sort of internationally, there's a whole series of pressure, everything from population growth of another 3 billion people in the next 4 decades, to climate change, to social economic disruptions, civil religious strife, whatnot. That's going to put general climate change, that's going to put general continuous pressure on with regards to migration, and in particular issues of war and civil war, in particular civil war-like circumstances, as in some countries in South America. So in that sense, on the demand side, we can expect demand to remain the same or more likely to intensify. Then in terms of U.S. cooperation, so cooperation with the U.S. has been absolutely critical to maintaining the integrity of the system, everything from enhanced travel authorizations, biometric travel documents, intelligence exchange. And I just cite as one example that the cooperation with the U.S. authorities between mid-2017 and mid-2018 has reduced the flow of people across the border, irregular travelers, crossers, from 87 to 42. So it shows that demonizing our neighbor or calling into question the rule of law, circumstances, or integrity in our neighbor is strategic folly that, given the changes that we've made, it's in terms of making it more difficult to come to Canada by air for people who might otherwise be inadmissible, we will continue to expect greater pressure along the land border. And so cooperation, obviously, since we only have one bilateral partner on the land border, is going to remain integral. And then there's sort of supply side issues that were already mentioned by the Auditor General and others with regards to, and Neil Yates' report on the system. I also, in terms of context, I think need to point out that there's a social contract with regards to immigration in Canada, and it has 3 cornerstones. One is a well-administered migration policy around rules, principles, a principle approach, rule of law that preserves the integrity and the security of Canada's borders. The second component is the successful economic and political socialization and integration of migrants into Canadian society. And the third is that immigration is of collective benefit to Canadian society and to Canadian prosperity overall. And it is those 3 components that are integral to safeguarding the integrity, the sustainability, and the legitimacy of the immigration system. And I would say that the Auditor General's report, as well as Neil Yates' report and others, point to that there's questions by Canadians and others around how well administered the system is. There's questions about being able to control borders in order to ensure a principled approach to migration. There's challenges around socialization and integration of migrants. I mean, we have at 1% of our population now in a legal immigration rate, compounded by a surge in refugee claimants. There are serious challenges around whether the premise of the last over 100 years in terms of immigration and socialization of migrants is going to continue to obtain within our society. And I think there's also some question about whether we'll be able to sustain the collective benefits. So what's the broader problem? That people are taking advantage of the right to claim asylum without meeting the criteria for eligibility. So the challenge then is to make Canada's refugee policies more timely and effective in distinguishing between persons who are genuinely in need of protection within the scope of Canada's international agreements from aspiring economic migrants who are seeking to exploit loopholes in Canada's border management system. And so to that effect, we have had and we've been observing a trend towards what I might call a libertarian approach to borders that is essentially facilitated by the ease of transportation, communication, broad communication strategies, mis and disinformation through social media and otherwise in terms of accessibility to Canada and whatnot, and that then facilitated on a global scale by systematic human smuggling that is well documented and amounts to some $10 billion a year. So by not ensuring that we have an integral system, we are also implicitly aiding and abetting the global human smuggling industry. So I also want to dispel the idea that somehow we can wait out the current political executive in the US. The phenomenon we're seeing might have been exacerbated by some decisions made by the Trump administration, but we can demonstrate empirically that it long precedes the advent of the Trump administration. So it will persist beyond the Trump administration. And so we will need to find a sustainable approach to this. By way of example, 2/3 of the people who cross irregularly...
Mr. Leuprecht, you're speaking fast and it makes it difficult for the interpreters to...
For the interpreter, keep up. I'll slow down. I have this problem regularly before committee, so I'll slow down. I make them sweat. Sorry. So the single largest group of migrants to Canada in terms of irregular entrance has actually been Nigerians who entered the United States on visitor visas. We also have the same documented phenomenon with regards to Saudi nationals. I quote those in particular because that is open source information. And that is, for instance, where cooperation with U.S. authorities is integral, given that that is the mainstay of about 2/3 of the people who are crossing irregularly. It is not individuals who are seeking to escape decisions with regards to temporary protected status, as some people have suggested. So it's important to maintain effective checks and balances, to maintain access to our asylum system for people in need of protection, while limiting actual and prospective abuses to the system. And so I point here in the legislation, in particular to Section 306. I think that with my colleague Jeffrey Hale, with him I co-authored the submission, that an absolute ban on sequential applications may be an excessive response to a valid concern. For reasons that we don't have time to get into, but different administrative processes and whatnot, we will suggest to limit the proposed exclusion to eligibility for refugees to a limited period, perhaps to 3 years from the date on which previous claims in such countries with which we have agreements have been finalized. With regards to Section 304, it makes sense the enforcement of reciprocity in the application of national immigration laws. The way that section is worded leaves lots of room for interpretation, and I have lots of concerns around the ambiguities that leaves with regards to the minister that would need to be clarified. In general, we strongly support the measures in the current budget, in particular given that it's always been difficult for governments to anticipate and manage all the trade-offs associated with policy decisions in general, in particular with regards to migration. I would like to close on the way forward. The way forward has to be restoring Section 41 of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, a regulation that's known as the so-called direct back provision. And that provision allows persons at significant risk to apply for refugee protection status from within the United States if they are not otherwise covered by provisions of the SCTA. Such measures would provide a safety valve in case of changes to U.S. temporary protected status provisions likely to create significant risks of another surge in irregular migration. However, a necessary condition of reinstating Section 41 would be to include amendments within the revised STCA providing for a standstill in prospective U.S. deportation proceedings for any person awaiting a Canadian refugee protection hearing under these provisions, and implementation of such measures would require safeguards to clarify the categories of persons at risk subject to such provisions to preserve the benefits provided by the STCA in providing effective triage of claimants from third countries.
We'll begin now with Mr. Sarai.
Thank you for all your presentations. I'll first ask Mr. Leuprecht. You spoke about the three kind of ingredients that make a successful immigration policy, and I won't go over them due to time, and you're a fellow at the NATO Defense College. How do you think this legislation, proposed legislation, it will be perceived by at least the Five Eye partners of ours who are members of NATO as well? Have you ever had any conversation with them, or is it in line with similar language maybe used by any of them?
So I think that's a very apt question because, of course, the challenges that we're discussing here are not unique to Canada. They're challenges from across the world. And I think one way to sum up the problem is the supply of potential migrants greatly exceeds the fiscal and social capacity of most receiving countries, as you point out, and the effective management of immigration policies is vital to our continued prosperity, social cohesion, and democratic legitimacy. And I think because Canada has so much of the world looks at Canada for being able to build a successful model, not just in terms of immigration, but what's unique in Canada, especially since the mid-1990s, and Keith Banting and Stuart Soroka have done some very interesting work on this, is actually the increase in popular support for immigration policies at the same time as we've raised the levels of immigration. So these are not necessarily negatively correlated. Okay. And so I think it is important that Canada is able to, in terms of the problem that I laid out, to lead by example, because so many other countries are struggling with this. And I think there's a risk that, in light of the challenges that I've laid out, and I think this is sort of the struggle that, so one of the uniquenesses in Canada is that 95% of people who come to Canada are people that Canada selects, and 5%, a little bit larger since 2016, are people who just show up. In Europe, we have the opposite challenge, where 95% of people are people who just show up. And so I think within the Five Eyes countries, there's a sense of that, because of our unique geostrategic situation, we have an opportunity to build and ensure we can coordinate a system that is legitimate and sustainable. And so I think if we can't find a way forward that effectively deals with the current circumstance in terms of irregular migration, I think it will send a signal to our partners that there's probably not much hope for especially our European partners, for instance, within the Dublin process, to find a measure of coordinating effectively on refugee policy. And I think the medium-term strategy within the Five Eyes, and I think most people sort of understand this also with the cooperation that we have, has to be a somewhat more harmonization of the way we approach this particular issue. I think, but there's a high level of awareness of exactly the problem you lay out.
Thank you.
I'll start with Dr. Leuprecht. You've written extensively, I think, about human smuggling and some of the issues. I was going to go on that, but I just want to touch on some of the comments that you were making with regard to the Dublin renegotiation and sort of the coordination of asylum system reform. It's my understanding that Canada can operate the Safe Third Country Agreement with the United States and still be in compliance with our international obligations because of some of the provisions that are in Article 19 of the Geneva Convention, which, again, are there to prevent asylum claim shopping, and how the agreement is structured. It seems to me that Division 16 of the Budget Implementation Act of Bill C-97, I think we're at, or whatever it is, that I think, I'm not sure it's going to survive. First of all, I don't think it's going to survive a court challenge in the Canadian context. It doesn't really impact people, like the minister just said, it's going to be impact about less than 10% of the people who have entered Canada from the U.S. In the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement and claimed asylum over the last few years. And for that reason, my position has been that we actually need to undertake, and one of the roles Canada could take is global asylum system reform, where we're looking at a network of safe third country agreements that we could use international fora to really lead a discussion on what constitutes a safe third country, what monitoring agreements need to be in place in order to ensure that those happen over a long period of time. But I don't think that Division 16 is that. I think it's a last-minute shortcut. It's kind of how I read it. That probably isn't going to work. Would you say that assessment is correct or in the right ballpark?
Look, we have to start somewhere. I think, given the current situation, I think I always say hope is not a method, and just sitting here and hoping something's going to change in light of the factors that I pointed out is not going to happen.
I know, and in this situation, though, like, this is not hope. There's something on the table, but if it's likely to be heavily litigated within the Canadian legal system and cost the government a lot, and then appeals, and then grandfathering, and blah, 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 as we often see, would that hope not be better placed in taking concrete action I mean, I look at, I was in Europe last year meeting with, European parliamentary colleagues of all political stripe, the Dublin renegotiation.
So
It's a start, but it, again, doesn't offer a lot of hope. And I'm just wondering if perhaps what Canada should be doing is really taking a leadership position and saying, look, we support asylum claims. We don't support asylum systems being used to facilitate economic migration. And here are the venues by which economic migrants can come into Canada, which is frankly, I think, really calling a spade, what's happening in Canada right now.
So I think the Dublin negotiations, as you know, with regards to refugees are at an impasse. And I think one of the things that Ken needs to think about, yes, we need to establish an international regime among countries that are sought after as destination countries, ultimately. As the bill points out, we already have, and Mr. Sarai also pointed out, we have a Five Eyes arrangement emerging, and that's the most likely prospect that I think we build this bottom up. At the same time, I think we could do better at how can we incentivize better behavior by people, for instance, within the Dublin process that are the veto players. And I'd suggested, for instance, even at the time when the government decided to admit a significant number of Syrian refugees, that we could perhaps use some of the numbers that we have at our disposal to incentivize the sort of agreement that the Europeans are currently lacking by saying that Canada will bail out, for instance, some of the countries that are veto players in the Dublin process currently for X number of years. So these countries can very slowly not only ramp up systems, but
that
can
sounds
also,
like a lot of money.
It's
So if I may, just because I'm running out of time,
we're gonna need incentives.